All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. Let's go ahead and get the ball rolling. I know it's relatively early for some of you, and I want to hold up the rest of our day. I think my goal is to try to keep these webinars, so give or take about 30 or so minutes. Ultimately, I don't want to get too deep into reviewer, kind of introducing the platform and demoing the software. I think the goal here, like we typically do with our webinars, we host 8 to 10 per month, is to make them more education driven. So for a little bit of context here, as many of you may already know, Revere works with hundreds of associations across the globe in a wide variety of industries and different demographics. On top of that, we do thousands of campaigns within the platform, from recognition awards to scholarships to grants to board nominations, volunteer committee applications, you name it. So we're very fortunate to have a lot of clients running programs in a lot of different ways. And over the course of now 15 plus years or so, we've been able to see virtually every imaginable workflow that you can think of. And with that comes a lot of data. And so for us at Reviewer, we try to guide our clients through best practices and trends and emerging trends of how to optimize your program based off of, the real challenges that many of you guys are facing. And that's kind of why we host these webinars, is to kind of give back and share some of the trends that we're seeing, what the data tells us, and how you can take that and incorporate it and apply it to your programs. Of course, with Reviewer, but also, of course, without the system. And so, to kind of set the stage again for today's topic, it really comes down to volunteer fatigue. And so, I know the topic is awards judging in one evening, not 1 month. That's kind of the marketing lingo behind the concept. But I think we can all agree that a lot of time and energy goes into the review and selection of our award recipients. And to be very clear, for those of you guys doing scholarships or grants or board nominations, volunteer committee apps, fellowships, conference speaker, abstract proposals, this concept is still going to apply to all of those different types of campaigns. But again, I think we can all agree a lot of time and energy goes into it, both operationally getting the framework in place and getting the structure in place, but then also at the end of the day, the volunteers, the committee members, the ones who are actually actively judging and scoring these submissions. And so why this is important, again, we'll kind of jump right into today's conversation, is I think we look at it from a volunteer perspective. We say, hey, our team is spending so much time, so many hours. Like, what does that mean for them? What does that mean for volunteer engagement? What are the odds of them coming back and doing it again next year? What is their experience and their engagement levels with you guys as an organization? And that's valid. That is one of the two people that kind of play within the space. But I think the often underlooked demographic is, what is having that process look like? And what is the impact on the nominees or the applicants themselves? Again, we say, okay, our volunteers are spending so much time. It's unfortunate for them. How do we help them out? But what we don't look at is, again, the negative impact and ramification on the nominees, ensuring that every applicant gets the fair opportunity that they deserve, making sure that the review team doesn't start to rush through submissions, making sure that the judging tendencies of your committee stays consistent and doesn't deviate. What I mean by that is, if I'm a volunteer reviewing submissions, how do I ensure like the 30th person that I review is actually scored on the same scale as the 10th person that I reviewed? And we have really clear data at Reviewer that kind of gives us some insights into, on average, when does volunteer fatigue set in? How many submissions should be reviewed by each evaluator, vice versa? How many times should a nomination be reviewed? How many stages typically goes into these programs? Obviously, your goal isn't to go from submission to decision in one pass. A lot of times there might be multiple stages or rounds kind of set up in a way to kind of move applicants through that pipeline, and then at each stage lowering the fatigue levels for the evaluators. Also, where does AI play a role in this? So I think my goal today was make it more of like an eye-opening conversation that's not just about the volunteers. It's what happens to them has a direct impact on the applicants themselves. And so what I want to introduce is some of these metrics and some of the findings that we have and some of the concerns that we have around the review process, and then give you guys practical next steps and ways to actually solve those problems with or without Reviewer. It comes down to how you structure the review processes, the phases of review, the tools that you're leveraging, the scorecards that you're using, the ratios of how many submissions per evaluator, relatively small things that absolutely do incrementally compound, and the data doesn't lie. So for me, there's kind of three steps to this. Step number one is, what is the actual fatigue problem? And I already kind of introduced some of the impacts on it, but what do the numbers tell us? Number two is, how do we leverage that information and some of those metrics to structure a proper review workflow where we're, managing the actual fatigue levels of the review team, looking at their time on task. How do we handle things like conflicts of interest? How do we handle things like scores deviating from one evaluator to another? So, for example, if I, as Kyle, as a volunteer, give out, scores of 30s and 40s left and right, but Susie on the same committee gives out scores of 15 or 20, right? Is there really a 10-point difference between our two scores, or is it just our own personal tendencies? And if that is true, how do we not, put an applicant at a disadvantage because they were assigned to Susie but not to me, right? And then the third thing that we're going to look at is how do we piece all of this together and give the review team a very structured selection process where everything that they need to do a review is side by side on one page next to each other, keeping them on task, keeping them consistent with how they're doing their evaluations across themselves, but also across their peers, making sure that everybody's kind of in alignment. And how do we take what traditionally speaking is an 8, 9, potentially 10-hour process per evaluator and turn it into a nice little evening activity for, 2 hours once the kids go to bed on their tablets on their couch. So let's kind of dive into the meat and potatoes. For many of you, I think, you're looking for some of these slides, you're looking for recaps. I'm absolutely going to be sending out a call recording as well as this deck. So keep an eye out for that follow-up. I do want to leave you with one slide. This is kind of like the too lazy, didn't read playbook. If you remember one slide at all, it's going to be this. And so I'm going to really briefly kind of just run through this list. Of course, so you guys can see it on my page. But number one is on the left-hand side is what's currently happening. On the right-hand side is what we want to kind of strive to get to. And so generally speaking, for most organizations, they have a review committee that's in charge of reviewing all the submissions, right? Some of you guys are a bit more advanced. You have multiple awards. Each award category has its own dedicated team or its own dedicated committee. Maybe some of you guys have multi-phase processes where you've got a certain team in phase one, and your main task is to narrow that pool down to phase two, where a smaller number of people come in and review a smaller number of applicants. That's great. But for the vast majority, you've got a review committee. Applications come in. You basically say, here's the pool, go review them, no matter how many that is. And so for us, we want to have a very thoughtful design around which committee members are reviewing which submissions, setting workload caps based off of those metrics and the math that I'm about to introduce to you. I do believe, generally speaking, it shouldn't be one giant marathon from submission down to decision. I think a lot of times we look at multi-phase or multi-round selections as additional work, right? They're extra stages, extra steps, when in reality they're not. A lot of times we can leverage automations and we can leverage AI, we can leverage different team members to take the larger pool of nominations, pre-vet them, pre-review them, figure out who the consensus is that we want to advance onto another stage. And then at that point, when we really bring in our volunteers, have them, use scorecards and actually start to dive deeper into the content that was submitted to get from, stage two down to the final selection. So I don't want you guys to think that a multi-stage process is more work. It's really not, but it does kind of actually move people through the pipeline. And then at each stage, reducing the time on task for everybody involved. From an actual review perspective, again, I'll kind of introduce this in a moment. Without using tools like Reviewer, typically speaking, a lot of manual work on your end comes into play of having to take these nomination or application packets, download them, export them, recompile them into PDFs, put them into spreadsheets. You're emailing them out to your committees, you're putting them onto Google Drive, you're using your AMS. And then you're basically telling them to go access these files, download them, leave their comments and leave their scores in a spreadsheet and send it back to you. The number one way to lower volunteer fatigue is to shave off, 3 to 6 minutes per review. And the only way that you can do that is with a dedicated hub where the review team comes in. Everything that they need to see is on one side, the selection criteria is on the other. They just basically work down their list and their queue, stay hyper focused on the task at hand, rinse and repeat, and then move on with their life. Plus, operationally speaking, giving you guys the tools and to automate those scores and do the auto tabulations for you. The next bullet point actually goes hand in hand with the first one, right? It's assignments. Again, I don't think that we want to assign everything to everybody. There should be some thoughtful design around, randomizing who reviews whom, the order in which that they show up, having dedicated committees by stage. The conflict of interest element, again, seems like a relatively small thing. At its very core, from a compliance perspective, if there is a chance that there is a conflict of interest with one of your evaluators seeing information that they shouldn't see, obviously data redaction comes into play, and also being able to recuse himself and self-declare. One of the key things I want to introduce later on, I'm going to introduce a way to lower time on task with review by doing random assignments. I am going to introduce a risk with that, and that risk is basically not every evaluator reviews every submission. And so in that example, what happens if one of your committee members on average just scores way higher or lower than their peers? How do we not penalize an applicant? So at Reviewer, we have a concept called normalization that can actually identify the individual judging tendencies by your committees and by your staff and actually take it into consideration. And then the last piece of the puzzle is chasing the review team. No matter what we do, people will procrastinate. They always do. You're going to have some very eager volunteers who come in, they knock it out right away. That's great. We want more of them, but the bulk of them are going to slowly progress through the selection process. You've got very clear timelines and deliverables and milestones on your end, and we have to hold them accountable. And so, how do you guys have very clear visibility onto the review progress? Who's logged in, who hasn't done anything, what's their progress percentages, and then not manually make you chase them down by email and through phone calls. How do we leverage automations to kind of nudge them and send them reminders? So let's look at the actual data first and foremost before we jump into any solutions. So right now, the average hourly wage for a volunteer is $36.14. And I don't think a lot of us look at volunteer time from a dollar numerical perspective. A lot of them are, unpaid volunteers. It could be actual staff. But they are allocating time outside of their day, outside of their daily job obligations to help you guys with the review. And so I do think it is important to map that time back to a typical judging experience. And so we know when they signed up to be a volunteer and kind of help with the review process, I think a lot of times expectations aren't set up front. They really don't understand like the task that they're going to be assigned to, how much of their obligate or how much time that they're obligating to apply to it. I also don't believe that they kind of signed up for a process where they're being told, hey, go to Google Drive, go to our AMS, download these 60 PDF packets, now go to this spreadsheet, log your comments and scores, and send it back to us, right? They thought that they could do this in a single evening in a very user-friendly way, and then it turned into a much more comprehensive process. And so, kind of three really terrible things start to happen. Number one is that those dollar amounts start to trickle up, right? And so, with 60 or so submissions, with the judging process that we talked about, we're looking at north of $200 per evaluator, right? So for many of you, are looking at thousands of dollars in volunteer time that we're spending. So if we're going to be spending that, how do we reduce that number, but also make sure that we're allocating it the right way? Number two is going to be them coming back the next year, right? Like, what are the odds of the volunteers having a strong experience and then making you guys each and every year chase down the volunteers, recruit additional people, always feeling like you're falling behind? We're going to get into some of the ratios here in that middle bucket. But if we know on average we want our review team to be looking at a certain number of submissions, the math has to add up. And if you don't have the volunteer pool or the number of people that we want to be reviewing, then you're actively always recruiting. So how do we make sure that we have a strong pipeline of volunteers that we can certainly always rely on? And then the third piece of the puzzle is actual completion rates, right? We know for a fact that every single one of these submissions that we're collecting has to be judged, has to be reviewed, has to be scored. And so what's going to end up happening is the team comes in, they start the process, they get overwhelmed, and they either completely back out or they wait until the very last minute. Deadlines have to get extended. These are all things that have a direct impact on you guys and your timelines. Number two is the scoring drifting. So, on average, most humans will come into whatever tools that you're using to do review, and they work down a list top to bottom. They also work left to right. The problem with that is if you're giving them a large number of submissions, I'm talking like north of 30, the data that we have suggests that volunteer fatigue sets in right around 30 or so submissions, give or take, depending on the complexity of your forms and depending on the complexity of your scorecards. And so if you assign them 50, 60, 70 submissions to look at, not only are they spending way more time, but the real meat and potatoes there is that submissions 30 through 60 are actually being scored on a completely different scale than the first 10 candidates that they looked at. Even though we're using the exact same scorecard, they start to rush through things. They give out either way higher or way lower scores. They don't fully read through things. They just start to kind of fill in the bubbles and assign point values. So again, what does that mean? It means that you've got really strong potential nominees, members, right? Who unfortunately were the 37th person that was reviewed. And because of that, they're actually not going to be given the fair opportunity that they deserve. That's unfortunate. We can't have that happen. We also know for a fact that on average, most submissions should be reviewed between 3 to 5 times. Anything less than three typically means that we don't have enough data to give us strong insights into the quality of the candidate. However, anything more than five is a law of diminishing return. 5 scores versus 25 scores doesn't really move the needle a whole lot when we start to average things out. So we're going to kind of come back to those numbers and how do we leverage that. But I think if you looked at your metrics and your insights, you're probably finding that most of your nominations are being reviewed more than 5 times. And by scaling that back, we're inherently also scaling back the number of submissions each of your volunteers are actually going to be looking at. The third thing is the safety net, which is the normalization. So on average, we see about a 10 or so point gap between your highest and median scorers, as well as the lowest scores versus the median. What does that mean? Again, if I randomly assign submissions out to a review team, we're basically leaving it up to the luck of the draw, right? If an applicant gets assigned to Kyle, the easy judge, they're at an immediate advantage over an applicant who's assigned to Susie, who is a tough judge. And we know that that's happening because, again, there's about a 10-point disparity, 40%, give or take, between the reviewers. And so if we know that there is a disparity, you can do one of two things. We can either leverage the math to coach them up and try to bridge that gap, which is very challenging. Or what we're going to say is, hey, we actually value your feedback. You're scoring the way that you are because that's how we recruited you. Those are the insights that we want you to be giving, but we also don't want to penalize an applicant. So instead of comparing Kyle's scores to Susie's scores, how do we compare all the applicants that Kyle reviewed against his or her own personal average, normalize it back out, and start to compare them against Susie? So let's look at some of those things. So again, the math is pretty straightforward. You guys can do this on your own time. Basically, we need to look at on average, like how many entries that you typically review. Start by plugging in three, right? So we want each applicant to be reviewed at a minimum of three times. You can move that needle a bit. You can call it four, you can call it five. Again, anything over five typically is overkill. So then we know, okay, well, that means on average we have 60 entries. We need about 180 reviews, right, to happen. We then take that number and divide it by the number of reviewers. And that gives us the average. So if you've got a 12-person team or a 12-person committee, great. That means each one is reviewing roughly 15 or so submissions apiece. You're well within the threshold of volunteer fatigue. If that number is higher than 30, then you have to look at kind of two different levers to pull. You can look at the number of reads per entry, right? So maybe you plugged in 7 or 8, you can scale that back down to 3 to 5, or you may need to start to look at recruiting additional help. I think for many of you, we think of like expanding the volunteer time as challenging. That certainly is true. But if we give them the proper experience, the odds are recruiting volunteers or having people repeat each and every year makes it easier. So that pool of judges does go up. You can also start to leverage your membership, right? Don't just look at your executive teams and your staff and your committees or the volunteer committees that applied. You can also look at prior year award recipients, maybe those who are not eligible this year. Maybe bringing in, if you're a chapter-based association, say there's a Nebraska chapter, maybe there's a Kansas chapter, leveraging Kansas to help review your submissions and also leveraging Kansas or reviewing Kansas's submissions for them. So there's lots of things that we can do to increase our judging pool. That latter model I actually really like for any of you guys who are chapter based, just because then you can also start to avoid things like biases and the relationships that we have with the applicants, right? Because we know that they have no idea or hidden agendas with it. So the math plays out very clear. This goes back to the two metrics I gave you. What is the fatigue line? And then on average, how many submissions or how many times should each submission be reviewed between 3 to 5 times? You just pull those two ratios to kind of make them in balance. Once you know this, we can then leverage that insights to actually build out the review process. And that's kind of what I want to show you next. So there's kind of three ways that we see this commonly done. You can do it by phase or review or by categories. So if you're a very standard association, you might give out 6 to 8 different awards and different award categories. It's very simple. Basically using tools like Reviewer, when an award nomination comes in, it automatically filters them down and auto categorizes them by the award. At that point, you can look at the math of how many award nominations you got per category. And then from there, start to actually build out review teams and build out review committees by category itself. So you might have like a Rising Star Award. There's a dedicated team who's only in charge of reviewing Rising Star. You might have a Volunteer of the Year Award. Again, you have a very dedicated team in charge of Volunteer of the Year. And again, your overall volunteer pool doesn't really change. You're starting to slice and dice them to split up the workload. You also may consider doing multi-phase, right? I'm going to kind of get into that here in an example, where maybe initially all the applications come in, and first and foremost, you want to vet eligibility criteria, which we can automate for you. You want them to score them on a very simple scale, like is this a high quality nomination, yes or no? Yes is move on to the more in-depth review, which can still mimic what I just mentioned with committee-based. The no's kind of get stopped in their tracks. Again, with that model, your team can actually review more than 30 submissions because it's not a comprehensive judging. It's a quick analysis of like, hey, does this deserve the time from the review team? Yes or no? If not, we'll stop them there. What you could also consider doing to make it really simple, and I'll show this to you, is randomization. You can basically say, okay, we have X number of submissions, we've got X number of evaluators, we know this is how many each reviewer should be looking at to avoid both volunteer fatigue, but also to ensure applicants are scored the same number of fair times. And then you type those numbers in, right? You say, I want every reviewer to be capped at 30, and then you let a tool like Reviewer actually just do the distributions for you and automatically. So what you're basically doing is you're collecting submissions, you toss in your volunteers, you toss in those metrics, and then you set it and forget it and let the platform of your choosing, kind of do those distributions for you. Alternatively, you can do a hybrid approach, right, of having, random distribution on a per category basis. Again, going back to what I mentioned earlier, I do like a two-phase review process for multiple different reasons. Obviously, one of the core reasons why, right, is that we can use it as a way to lower fatigue by having a pre-vetting process. We're splitting the team in half. We're letting certain people review just the pre-review, other people do the full scorecard. But also, we're not wasting the time of our volunteers, right? We don't want to waste their time reviewing applicants who just quite frankly are not going to be selected due to the quality of the work or they're not eligible or for whatever reason. And so not only are we kind of lowering their time on task, but we're also keeping them hyper focused on the high quality candidates. And so for you guys, I think generally speaking, 2 to 3 phases is optimal. But again, the math that tells the entire story. I want to kind of continue to reiterate that, where you take the total end of submissions that you've received, and then kind of figure out like how many stages that we need to get through, where each stage we're hitting kind of those limits that we discussed. And again, I'm probably not going to get too deep into this today, but much of that could be automated, right? And so if you have a submission experience, like platforms like Reviewer should have built-in eligibility checks. So the applicants answer a series of questions. It tells you if they're eligible or not. If they're not eligible, you can segment them out, or you can actually tell them, hey, because of X, Y, and Z reason, you're no longer eligible for this award category. Pick another, right? So we're not going to waste their time, nor your team's time. You could also leverage tools like AI to actually pre-read, pre-score, provide summaries, right? To help you kind of figure like who is the clear consensus that should move on. Here's the clear consensus that shouldn't move on. And then you're going to be left with this gray area where we want humans to inject themselves to actually manually review. And again, that's where the time actually ends up going. So let's look at then how do we practically take advantage of this? So let's backtrack here a little bit. I'm going to jump into a really simple example here. This is an alumni award that we work with. I think does a pretty good job of this. They in themselves do multiple different award categories. They also have multiple stages to this. So first and foremost, let's look at the metrics. So again, I'm not going to run through Reviewer entirely. I'm not going to look at the application process. I'm not going to look at any of the administrator functionality. What I do want to show you though is jumping right into how do we create review workflows. So in this example, which I think is actually a very common workflow for probably 90+% of membership-based associations, most of you don't offer a single award. You might offer 4 to 6 or 5 to 8 different award categories. So in this example, we only have four award categories. And then what basically happens is as a nomination comes in, the system knows if they're applying to the achievement category or the promise category. Based on their selection, the system automatically will actually route the nomination to the appropriate bucket. So then when we come in as an admin, you're given this really clear grouping system that shows you a list of all of your categories. Each category is already filled up with the nominations respective to what they chose. And then at that point in time, what you can simply do is take a category and then pair that up with a team. So in our example here, whenever Tom, Cooper, and Sally enter Reviewer, they're simply only going to be scoring the Achievement Award submissions. When Tony, Talia, and Carrie come in, they're only looking at Distinguished. When Jasper, Jason, and Lennox come in, they only see the Promise category. So again, we still have the same volunteer committee. We have a large number of submissions, but we're kind of bifurcating it back down to evenly across the 4 categories and then giving each category to a subset of our team. So again, a couple things. Tom is not looking at all the submissions. He or she's only looking at those in his or her category, sub 30 ideally. Two, each applicant's now being scored by the entire committee. So the normalization that I'm about to introduce to you in a minute actually becomes less relevant because you don't care if Tom is a tough judge or a Cooper is an easy judge because each of them is scoring the same submissions. I am going to show you randomization here in a minute, which would actually impact that. The other thing you could consider doing is having subcategories, or you could replace this with the phases. So you could say we have achievement category, phase 1 review, phase 2 review. Maybe it's a large category. Maybe you are a single award submission, or maybe you do want your committee reviewing submissions across categories. That's great. So you replace these categories with phase 1 review, phase 2 review, phase 3 review. And then again, very similar, you basically take the phase 1 grouping and then Tom, Cooper, and Sally come in. So they're in charge of phase 1. You now have Tony, Talia, and Carrie, who might be part of your executive committee, who are only in charge of the final selection category. So again, it serves as a way to categorize submissions, progress submissions, and then pair them up with your team. So let's take a step back. I do think that for the vast majority of you, though, setting it and forgetting it with the math and using randomization is the proper model. So what you in theory could do is you could open up these review workflows and the system will show you a list of every single nomination and in theory who from your team could review them. What you can simply do at that point is bulk select them and say, hey, I want to auto assign each submission between 4 to 6 evaluators, or I want each one to be reviewed exactly 3 times, no more, no less. And or you could say, I want my review team to be capped at 30 apiece. And then what the system will do is it'll actually take the pool of people, both the nominations and the review team, and it equally and automatically kind of disperses it back out and it shares it across the team. So I do think that generally speaking, that is a really good model. Another alternative you could consider is a concept called judge queuing. And it's very similar, but actually makes it operationally easier for you. With this model, my only concern is that evaluators still, even with a very low barrier process, will procrastinate, right? And so you're at the end of the day still waiting on judges to finish up. Some submissions haven't been scored appropriate numbers of time. There might be conflicts of interest, right? Which means that you then have to do reassignments. So in this example, I can edit my assignments and say, well, Mark does have a conflict with Gabrielle, so I can just unselect her name and then reassign it back to somebody else. So it makes it very clean. To combat this, Judge Queuing basically says, look, let's take our entire pool of nominations, let's disperse it to the entire review volunteer committee, which means that they're literally assigned to all of them. What we then do is start to set thresholds. So we say, I want every submission to be scored 4 times, no more, no less. So the submissions get assigned out to the full team. They can come in, score as few or as many as they want. But once a nomination's been reviewed 4 times, it then falls off that list so nobody else can review them. So the pro of that, right, is it makes it very simple to set up. It also means that if a reviewer backs out or doesn't fulfill their obligations, that's fine because that submission hasn't been scored the appropriate number of times. So it still shows up on the list for everybody else. And so the team kind of just comes in, works at their own pace, down the list at their own pace. And then once all the submissions have been scored 4 times, nobody is left to be reviewed. Boom, you're done. So it is a really clean model. I am going to come back to that when I show you the review portal. That's the next conversation. But with that model, it's very, very important. And regardless, it's very important to randomize the order in which the review team sees their submission. So again, you might have taken all of my advice to heart and you implement this. You give every evaluator, let's just say 20 submissions to review. The challenge is that if my 20 submissions show up in the exact same order as Susie's list of 20 submissions, by the time we get to the last person, they are now being compared to everybody else above them, whereas the first, 3 to 4 submissions did not have that. There was nobody to compare them to. There is also an extent of volunteer fatigue starting to set in. So we know that looking at the raw data, that the first 5 submissions are never scored on the same scale as the last 5 submissions. So it's really important to take that order, shuffle it. That means when I come in to score, it's the same 20 submissions as Susie, but the order in which I score them will be very different than what Susie sees. So I want to make sure I touch on that now because it's a really key piece to the overarching puddle. So then, kind of just jumping around here a little bit, we've kind of talked through what is volunteer fatigue. We've looked at the numbers and the math to figure out how do we structure a review with that in mind. Now let's look at the judging and scoring process. And I'll keep this very simple for you. For any of you guys who are having the review team go to Google Drive, go to your AMS, and download these packets, open up their spreadsheets, fill out their scores, and send it back, we're adding a significant amount of unnecessary time for them. It also induces operational risk because tabulating the results, getting the data back from them, keeping them consistent is certainly going to start to deviate from the norm that we want to be following. The only way to properly execute a review process is giving your review team a dedicated tool that they can access on their tablets, mobile responsive, on their couch when their kids go to bed, in and out in less than an hour. Any other model doesn't work, right? And that's just the nature of the beast that they are volunteers. We need to make sure that their process is as seamless as humanly possible. And then again, making sure those results that come back in get to you guys in a way that you're not number crunching, playing with formulas, misaligning rows within a spreadsheet. So what does that look like? Ultimately, when the review team comes into reviewer, they get a very simple menu, which is a list of the nominations that they're in charge of looking at. So again, ideally speaking, this list never exceeds 30, give or take. We also have some built-in data redaction tools. So if you want to hide things like name or demographics or any PII, you certainly can do so. And then from the evaluator's perspective, again, they're not downloading anything. They're not going to 6 or 7 different tools. They come into one spot. They see the list. They then click on the nominations that they want to review. And then we then give them a split screen. So half of the page is that quote unquote nomination packet. That's a combination of the submission content and the file uploads. So if you're collecting things like resumes or letters of recommendation or photos or videos, all of those are going to be embedded within the app side by side. So they can watch a video, look at a photo, read a resume, look at the form all in one sitting. And then that left-hand side of your page is the built-in scorecards. So this is completely customizable. Whatever scorecards or rubrics that you guys are leveraging, we'll just mimic them within the system. They can be simple 1 through 5s, drop downs, check boxes. You can weight them. It's up to you. Now, a general best practice here is a lot of organizations will say, hey, rank this application on a scale from 1 to 20. It takes a human longer to score that because they have to differentiate a 16 versus a 17. Also, making that differentiation is very hard, so it kind of skews the metrics. So a lot of our clients are now pushing towards a more emotional based scorecard from below expectation to outstanding. Whenever a evaluator offers an emotional response, they're able to review things much quicker. And then also typically speaking, the quality of the scores also goes up tremendously. The name of the game here is how do we shave off an extra 1 to 2 minutes a piece, right? Because that incrementally compounds across your review team and your volunteers. And so in this example, the evaluator literally side by side has everything that they need. They can fill out the scorecard. Once they're done, they simply submit, they rinse, they repeat, and then boom, they're on with their life. Now, in real time, you and your staff can then start to generate the results. So on a per kind of bucket basis that I introduced earlier, you're going to have a list of all the submissions that were collected, who from your team reviewed them. Obviously, you're able to track review progress. And so if you've got committee members who either haven't started yet or they're only 20% of the way there and the deadline's tomorrow, you can leverage this information to automate reminder messages and nudges to them. And then as the scores start to come in, you can leverage it to generate results. So basically from high to low, I can start to see, total scores, individual scores, averages. There's also reporting that comes with this. And then you can leverage the auto result tabulations to start to make decisions. Either these are the award recipients, maybe you are going to do a multi-round process where you can say like, hey, let's take the top 15 and then at the bottom advance them to phase two. Or maybe your committee chair or your team gets together, you pull this up, and then you leverage these insights for really impactful deliberation meetings. And who knows, maybe you want to share some of these insights with your team in advance, right? Redacted, make it anonymous. That way they can kind of come to those committee meetings and to those deliberation meetings already prepared to be thoughtful to everybody else's time for constructive feedback and conversation. So, I guess a couple of last things I do want to address here. I do want to talk about normalization. So, at the end of the day, I love the concept of doing randomization. Again, set it, forget it. Each submission is scored no more than 5 times, no less than three. Each evaluator scores no more than 30. Boom, system does all that pairing for you. Again, the downside to that, though, is that Mark here might not be scoring Peyton. And so you can see that Mark gave a score of a 12, Judge Judy gave a 31. So what happens if what if on average Mark has never given higher than a 14? By his or her own standards, they actually scored Sheldon very, very well. However, Sheldon is absolutely being penalized because that score is bringing down the collective total and the collective average. So with that, you can start to leverage some of the built-in insights into reviewer. My goal is not to overwhelm you. What I want you to look at though is this green line. And what this report basically shows us is, hey, look, here's all of your committee members. Here's how they scored every single submission. And by the way, here's each of their own individual scores or their tendencies. And right away, the data jumps out. It says that Paul on average scores a 24, but Tony scores a 34. So again, any applicants who are assigned to Paul and not to Tony are at an immediate 10-point disadvantage, right? However, that's not true. A score of a 24 by Paul and a 34 by Tony actually isn't 10-point difference. They're the same exact score. It's their own personal average. Now that we know that, we can start to rank these submissions against each individual evaluator's averages, right? So if Paul scored somebody as a 24, it's no longer a 24. It's now a 1. It's an average score. Anything higher than average goes up, anything lower than average goes down. And then that new metric can then be averaged against the other committee members for your final results. I guarantee you that if you were to parallel this report with your current scoring reports, the results are going to look different. And again, that is the difference between a member being awarded or not, right? Fairly or unfairly. So it is a very important thing to look at. The other thing I want to look at is how we, in theory, could also leverage tools like AI. So at the end of the day, I think this was a really good conversation. Hopefully, there's something that you guys could walk away with. But you might be thinking to yourself, this is great, Kyle, but I've got a 7-person review committee and I get 101 submissions. There is no physical way I can have them look at less than 30 apiece. That's valid. So again, I would try to break your process into multi-phase to lower the time on task. And then number two, may leverage some of the AI tools. So what I'm about to introduce to you lives in Reviewer, right? It's already live. We have a lot of clients actively using it and very successful. However, the interface I'm going to show you is the next version of our judging portal that's set to come out here relatively soon. The only reason why I'm showing you this version versus the current version is I have 3 different AI models loaded up into it at the same time just for visual capacity for today. So again, review team comes in, the evaluator can see in real time how many submissions are assigned to them, what their dates and deadlines are, what their progress is. They can get some insights, right? So they would say, hey, it takes you on average 14 minutes to evaluate a submission. You've got 4 left, which means you probably should block off roughly an hour of time. So these are guiding principles to help your team stay on task. At that point, the evaluator comes in, they see the list of submissions to score, they simply click on the submission and they open up the scorecard. So they're still presented with that split screen scoring. The difference, however, is that we're going to now layer on AI. So with our AI tools, just from a compliance perspective to get it out of the way, we're not using your data to train any LLMs. It's not being used across clients. We're not sharing your information with tools like OpenAI or Anthropic. It's all natively in reviewer, safe, secure, Type 2 SOC 2 compliant. What basically happens is that we can analyze content. So we can use AI to analyze these submission packets. And that's a combination of both the submission forms and the file uploads. Once that data has been analyzed, we can then leverage prompts to do something with that. So we have some clients that will use prompts to track eligibility. We have some clients that will use prompts to kind of do auto data redaction. However, the 3 most common ways that AI is used is to create smart summaries. And so instead of saying, hey, volunteer, go read through this really comprehensive packet, they can then instead say, hey, review team, don't read through this comprehensive packet. At least in the first round of review, what we're going to do is give you a 1-page brief. And this is the really clear call outs or key details from the nomination that we want the review team to see. For many organizations, this gives them enough meat and potatoes to do a phase 1 judging and scoring. Again, if we can use this to get from 101 submissions down to 50 submissions and then take those next 50 submissions and do a full-on review, that's great. It did its task. It lowered the time on task. It allowed us to avoid volunteer fatigue and still made sure that the humans get involved. The way that I like to use AI the most is a hybrid. It's a combination of this plus the actual form content itself. And I call that, if I go back to my summary, scorecard alignment. So this is a call for abstract. This is a association using reviewer for a conference call for speaker. And one of the scorecard prompts that they have is clarity of the proposal. The problem with that is the data that the review team needs to score that lives in like 3 different places. It might live in a PowerPoint, it might live in a PDF, it might live in the submission form. And so even using a very user-friendly tool like split screens and judging built into the system, it requires them to find the information, remember it, and then go back and score it. You can't use summaries because it doesn't give you a full picture. So in this example, AI basically uses your scorecard and then finds all the data relevant to each prompt. So it says, hey, let's go find everything that's relevant to clarity of the proposal. And then it starts to bucket it for you. So it pulled it from, in this case, 2 different sources. One was from a form field called abstract, and then also a narrative question. Under originality of the approach, it might have pulled it from a file upload and from the form itself. So it's not creating summaries, it's not doing anything for you. It's basically fetching the data and pulling it forward to make the review process easier. Again, the goal here is to shave off 3 to 5 minutes a piece. And if you can do that, you can start to move the volunteer capacity threshold from 30 to maybe 50 to 60. Now, the more polarizing way that AI is used, this is the last thing that we're going to look at, is doing pre-ranking and pre-scoring. Do I believe that we should set it and forget it and say, hey, let's let a computer judge all of our nominations for us and live and die by it? Absolutely not. However, for some organizations, they want to do maybe a combination of one of 2 things. They either say, hey, look, we have large volume and large is relative. It's that ratio, right, of submissions versus committee size. and they say we can't have them review all of them, so how do we stay focused? And so they basically load into the system the prompting, the submissions, the guiding principles, and the scorecard. And then we leverage AI to pre-review, pre-score, pre-compare these candidates, and then leverage that new ranking to do shortlisting. So what the data would say is, hey, based off of the AI pre-review, these are the very clear, obvious consensus that should be moved on to a human review. There's also a very clear consensus of those that fell way short, like they're just not going to be feasible. Let's not waste our time on those. And then there's that gray area. And again, that's where you start to leverage either a combination of a very traditional judging process or using summaries to review the gray area. Some of those will move into the low consensus, some move into the high consensus. And then again, now your high consensus pool ideally is a smaller number. And then the humans come in and they take over doing their normal judging and scoring. That's the most common way it's used. In theory, the other way that it could be used is to help guide the review team. At the end of the day, humans miss things. And so by leveraging AI to pre-rank and pre-score the submissions, you can show your review staff how it was scored. And then at that point, they're still doing their normal review. But what they're basically doing is saying, yes, I agree with this, or I want to modify it. Because it's very possible that AI caught something that a human didn't, or vice versa. So I think there is a hybrid approach. This is certainly the more polarizing approach. If I back up here just a little bit, I do believe that either smart summaries or scorecard alignment are the proper methods I would probably start to inject for most programs. So with all that said, I ran give or take 8 or so minutes long. I do want to kind of pause there for any questions you guys might have for me. As I'm waiting for questions to come in, again, kind of 5 moves that you guys can make right now. Probably not without reviewer, but you could in theory try to do this without us. Is number one, looking at what the numbers are, right? On average, how many submissions do you get? How big is your volunteer committee? And do you have a volunteer fatigue problem? Yes or no? If no, great, you're in a good spot. Obviously, injecting platforms with side-by-side judging and scoring, having some of the normalization results does go a long way. But if you do have volunteer fatigue, great. Then what's the next step that we have to take off? How do we look at our review workflows and our assignment engines and our models to figure out how do we kind of break that workload across our team? Once you've picked your assignment model, excuse me, then let's start to look at our scorecards. How do we start to revisit how we do our judging and scoring? How do we shave off, again, 3 to 5 minutes per submission? So even if they are scoring more than 30 submissions, to get them much more down to a happy place. So with all that said, I will sit here. I'll hang out for as long as you guys want and answer any questions I can. It can be about today's conversation. It can be around overarching challenges that you're trying to solve with your awards are relevant of today's topic. Again, very fortunate to see virtually anything and everything. Lots of organizations I've had the capacity to talk to. Yeah, or it could be at the platform itself. So again, I'll pause myself and I'll hang out for as long as you guys want. Okay, getting pretty quiet. I do appreciate all of your time here today. Like I mentioned beforehand, I will be sending out a recap of today's conversation, a combination of the slide deck, the presentation, some supporting resources and articles. Obviously, if you guys have any questions for me, please do let me know. If you want to kind of dive deeper into your unique programs and processes, either from a consultation perspective or to explore reviewer, we'd love to have those conversations, but I really do appreciate all of your time today. Have a good one.